All right, I'm going to call this meeting to order. Dr. Russell,
Here.
Mr. Saylor is here, that's me. Mr. Keenan's not here. Dr. Kolar, Ms. White, not here yet. Mr. Marsh,
Here.
Mr. Clellan, two here's, Mr. Liggett, Mr. Larson,
Here.
Mr. Cohen, Ms. Lofton,
Here.
Ms. White, Ms. Smith, excuse me, not here. Ms. Moran,
Here.
Mr. Weaver,
Here.
Dr. Boyd. Okay, join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Comments from the public? Seeing none. Section 2, review cycle. Gotta get on this thing properly before I fall. Nothing in the review cycle section. Go down to section 3, 3.01. 800 records management.
Thank you, Mr. Saylor. And Mr. Ganesh and I will tag team this. We did receive a PNN, which is a Policy News Network, in May from PSBA, and wanted to incorporate the policies that were recommended and the revisions that were recommended. There's one new policy, and then some revisions recommended to both 800 and 830. So I'll ask Mr. Ganesh to speak to these revisions and address any questions. We did have some questions from Dr. Weston that have prompted some thinking, and we will address those as we share some of what administration is recommending to the committee.
All right, let me start with policy 830.1, which is a new policy for the district. This policy from PSBA was reviewed, and the recommendation from the administration is to adopt this policy as presented. As Dr. Weston pointed out, there were some questions regarding PII, personally identifiable information. The definition provided by PSBA is quite comprehensive, and the administration is comfortable adopting this property adopting this policy as presented. Any questions on 830.1? If not, the other two policies are existing policies. 800, the records management policy. The revisions to these policies is update to the delegation of responsibilities, and also to strengthen the records management, the record management plan, and also it goes into some details about. Just hold on a little bit, Dr. Ross. How we deal with manual records, and also what we require our service providers to comply with our records management plan. That's 800. That's 800.
Mm-hmm.
And the policy 800.1.
Might just mention that. So just to mention that with policy 800, we've essentially incorporated all of PSBA's recommendations to
Right.
our policy and eliminated anything that was left in our policy but not recommended by PSBA. So there's a lot of notations in there. That's essentially what we are recommending to the committee.
And the next policy is the policy 830, which is again an existing policy, and there are quite a few revisions to this policy. Primarily, the definitions. There are new definitions for discovery, determination, encryption, and personal information. Again, our recommendation is to adopt this policy as presented. Any questions?
None? Okay. So any objections to moving 800, 830, 830.1 over?
No, that seems straightforward.
Okay. Local policy reviews, 4.01. We'll start with field trips.
So just to be clear, Mr. Saylor, those three policies are being recommended for first reading?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to be clear with that in the notes. Okay. So as we move to local policies, we wanted to come back to the field trips conversation, policy 121, and the board and the policy committee has been talking about this policy for some time now, and what administration is recommending is something that came out of a conversation recently, that the district take a step in the direction of supporting field trips that are curricular aligned field trips. Right now, each grade level, K through 8, is scheduled to take one curricular aligned field trip each year. So the recommendation on the part of Mrs. Smith and I is that the district cover the cost. These are learning experiences outside the classroom, and that's really the justification for this recommendation. As we've shared once before, there are some districts that do that. So we're not including celebratory trips or experiences like the 5th grade celebration or the 8th grade celebration, and instead, we believe this is a reasonable starting point for the district if the policy committee agrees and would like to start there. Next year, there should be one trip. So these costs would include admission or registration, transportation, and nursing. We have to send a nurse on every field trip now. If we have a parent who's qualified and is available and willing to go, who's a certified nurse, we send them. But often we are paying the cost to send a nurse on a field trip. So there was a question again from Dr. Weston about why just K through 8 and why not the high school at this point? And my response would be, and this is for conversation, is that the high school is not as symmetrical in terms of each grade level or subject area taking a particular trip. They're sort of different and very connected to the experiences of students by course. So this would be a starting point for us, and we would like to build upon considerations around these field trips that represent learning experiences outside the classroom. So this is for consideration. We've changed the language in Policy 121.
Dr. Russell, a couple questions just about that. For the high school, the 2 field trips that I'm aware of that, excuse me, are curricular aligned are the AP Bio field trip and the, the trip to DC for the students.
Black History?
The Black History
Yes.
class, yes, that's what it's called. Are there
Yeah.
other curricular aligned field trips that take place at the high school?
Good question. Maybe I can defer to Mr. Marsh. Those are the 2 that stand out in my mind right now.
Yeah, those are the 2 that came to mind with me, Mrs. Lofton. I'm doing a quick search on the school calendar for any others that might pop out, but I don't have any that come to
I
mind.
remember my daughter going to East for a Romeo and Juliet performance. I think. No, where did they go for? No,
That was AP Psych, maybe, to New York City?
No,
No.
Mr. Clement
That happened
took-
once.
Yeah. Okay, that was
not gonna
that's
happen
not
again.
a regular thing. Okay.
No.
Yeah, those are the only 2 coming up on a quick search
Okay.
that come to mind. There may be others that I'm not aware.
I think the connected English class has a trip each year, but I don't know that it's to the same place every year. But I know they do a field trip, like a career-related field trip.
But do we know what those costs are that are associated with those trips? I mean, if it's
Last time we had a discussion,
I
the
would-
high
yeah.
school, the discussion was that they would cover their cost for the classes that would have the trip, as opposed to the district covering the entire cost, because you didn't have it going across the entire grade level. And I think that's still valid.
I mean, certainly in the case of like get AP example. Yes, sorry. Yeah, I agreed. Certainly in the case of the AP class example, because it doesn't seem like all the students would have an opportunity to do that.
so they're
But
really.
I don't know
yeah.
what the costs are either, so.
From a different perspective, just checking with Mr. Cleland, I can say with the surety, there are no grade level where everyone goes curricular trips.
Okay.
So everything is a specific niche of the course. We cannot come up with any grade level curricular trip. The Disney trip's a different thing for the
Right,
senior, so if that helps, the committee make a decision.
So any other questions on this policy with the K to 8? Yeah, Dr. Kolar.
Is there going to be like a budgetary cap for teachers or grades so that they kind of stay within a suggested guideline? Because not that people would take advantage of it, but if it was the district's paying for it, I wouldn't want to see like all of a sudden now that we're going on these extravagant field trips because students don't have to pay for it. So can we come up with something where you stay within reasonable guidelines?
Yeah, I think Mrs. Smith and I can absolutely work on that, and maybe we want to consider something like total cost not to exceed $80,000. I put 70,000 in the notes because that's the estimate, but we could absolutely consider that so that it doesn't become something much bigger than what we've planned for. Yeah.
That would, yeah. I mean, that could be more air because it fluctuates. Obviously, when gas prices go down, then that'll massively reduce the cost of a trip. Something happens to that market, then all of a sudden a trip gets a little bit more expensive because of just the cost of transportation.
I'm talking more about like the nature of the trip. Like, you know, we go to the museum, but now the district's going to pay for it, so let's do this. You know, like, I don't see that happening, but I just think it's better to cover our bases.
Yeah, and
So-
I'm with Dr. Kohler there because if you come up with a cap, Dr. Russell, then, you know, even if there's fluctuations in cost, then it's a matter of prioritization, right?
So how does that sound to you, Dr. Kolar, a not to exceed number? We've estimated 70,000, so we could present to the board not to exceed 80,000, just to be careful, or something between 70 and 80.
So I think for policy that makes sense, but I think there should also be some guidelines for the people planning these trips
Yeah.
so that they know that they
Yeah.
still have to stay within
Yeah.
a reasonable budget.
Yeah.
So the guidelines would come in the form of an admin reg or a protocol for our teachers that we could develop at the beginning of the year through the summer. So we can certainly work on that.
Dr. Weston, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering, how would the 8th grade French class trip to Quebec be treated under this proposed revision of policy? Is that a curricular aligned trip?
It certainly is a curricular aligned trip. They haven't taken it for a few years now. They're not attending that trip. It doesn't,
I assume that has something to do with COVID, has something to do with that.
you know, I don't know that it was solely COVID that discontinued that trip, but that could be something we could look into. I think we were thinking in our recommendation to the committee, it would be a grade level, and it's aligned to a particular subject area or curriculum, some content within a curriculum that they cover. Some students take French, not all students, and right now we're not taking that trip. So that would be something else for us to discuss. That's in a gray area, so to speak. It's not included currently in the projections.
Could I suggest that perhaps we could, after the word curricular aligned, maybe state that it needs to be an entire grade level, and that would take care of these other issues?
Where specifically are you?
Section guidelines 6.
Thank
The
you.
district will cover expenses for K through 8 curricular aligned, and then it goes on to field trips, including transportation. Perhaps we could put in there for the entire grade or some wording so that, say, the Quebec trip, at least at this point, is kind of left out. This way, our intention is clear that the entire grade is meant to be going on these field trips.
Yeah, I'm with Mr. Liggett. I don't want to be too prescriptive, so that if Dr. Russell, if the ARs can be written in a way and maybe bring it back, that it has some guidelines, mostly to something that's inclusive to the whole grade level, but with some flexibility, right? Because in case, what if it's 75% of the grade or something? But anyway, you know, to the other example from Mr. Weston, respectfully, like that's an awesome thing, right? To go to Quebec, and I just think though that that would be extravagant, and that wouldn't be for the whole grade. So I think we should stick with curricular aligned to something that's aligned to a grade.
All right, any other questions on this?
Not really a question, just a grammatical note under authority. I believe the verb should be is, not are, because it's modifying financial obligation.
1, 2, or 3?
2.
Thank you. Any objections moving this forward to first read? All right, seeing none. 204, attendance.
Do you want me to speak to that, Dr. Russell?
Yes, you You can get us started. Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Boyd. Yeah.
There was some clarification that we wanted to make to this policy and add some clarity to around what happens when students accumulate 10 or more days and what do we require. So when we looked at this, there was also within this policy, students are afforded the ability to take 10 days of absences during any given school year with parental notification. That is also inclusive of up to 5 days for trips. So you can see where we struck from the language a maximum of 10 days of cumulative lawful absences. We took out for illness because it's not solely illness. So we wanted to remove that. That was causing some confusion for our families. So we want to clarify that and have it accurately reflected. And then the next piece is once a student acquires or accumulates 10 days of illness, what happens then? It previously said may require a note from a physician. But again, very gray. We wanted to clean that up and clarify that, and so we've given some parameters to it where a note shall be required from parent for days beyond 10, and if there's 3 or more consecutive days, at that point, that's when we would want a physician's note. Typically, when a student is out for 3 or more consecutive days, it's usually due to some sort of an illness, so we would look for that beyond the 10 days. And then we had talked about, are we striking the student attendance conference for 15 days total? Dr. Russell, I see that looks like it's struck through.
That appears to be an error to me.
Okay.
So that was not the intent.
Okay, so this was another addition
Not
that,
struck through here.
Yeah, the copy we received, it was not struck through.
okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened
I
there. I'll
don't
clean
believe
that
it
up.
should be.
It's not.
That's an addition, and again, it's to bring more clarity to the policy, as well as engage with our families in a proactive manner. If we have children that are that have 15 or more absences in any given school year, we want to meet with our families to talk and find out, are there barriers that are preventing the child's attendance? Are there other factors that we need to consider? So at 15 or greater total days during any given school year, the district or the school would reach out to the families and engage in a conversation to discuss what they might need or what we could do to make sure a child's attending school, because we know that tends to impact performance and their education. So those were the recommended changes.
Any questions?
Yeah, Dr. Boyd, I think it's great. This should be addressed, so I like the changes that you're proposing. Can I just get clarity, when we say that we go beyond 10 days, then a note is required from a practitioner if they have 3 or more consecutive days of illness. So they could be out the 11th day, that's still just a parent's note. A 12th day, a 13th day later in the year, et cetera,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
Okay, up until 15.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted that to be clear, because it was slightly unclear from the language in there. Okay.
And just to clarify, because I know there have been some other questions from individuals about attendance, even if a student is absent more than 15 days, 15 is that threshold where we really want to sit down and have a more formal conversation in the form of these student attendance improvement plans. These are recommended by the state and implemented when school districts believe they're most appropriate. We do have touch points prior to that. This would be a formal meeting. If a student is absent 16 days and still brings a note from a parent that meets the criteria for an excused absence, they're excused.
So I do have another question about this. I recall when we changed this probably several years ago from shall to may, Mrs. Lewis had come to policy committee and expressed concerns that she had been receiving from parents, for example, when students are sent home for lice and can't come back for, until they've gone through the appropriate treatments. But it's not necessarily something that they felt that they needed a physician's note, and so there was a burden that was being placed on students. If they had been accumulated 10 days, and now for some families, that was creating a financial burden for them to have to also then get a doctor's note in that situation. And so we were asked for flexibility to accommodate situations, particularly those situations where students are being sent home from school. Let's say they threw up, they can't come back for 24 hours, so they're going to be homesick the next day, but not necessarily a situation where the parent would normally feel that they needed a medical evaluation. And so that's why we were asked to take it back from shall to may. And so I'm just curious what shifted that you're not allowing that latitude for individual circumstances like that.
So the intent is not to eliminate the latitude completely, but to incorporate some accountability that seems reasonable. So after 3 days absence, you know, is that now if a student is diagnosed with lice, you raise a good point. We don't want to put individuals in a position where they face a hardship because they have to go to the doctors for lice. But the idea was, if this is an extended absence beyond that 10, is 3 days reasonable if they are consecutive for illness? Now, maybe we want to talk about something a little bit different. You know, we would be open to that. But the intent is to still be flexible. However, with that beyond 10, be a bit accountable to students who continue to be absent.
So with your example with the lice, I mean, it says a note from a licensed practitioner. If the school nurse diagnosed the lice, couldn't that just be
Yes.
a note in
That's
the
where I was-
child's
Yeah,
attendance
right.
that, you know, this
That's-
child?
Yeah, I think that, you know, when it's a situation where the nurse is sending the student home sick and says you can't come back for 24 hours, and now, right, I think that was the situation that was presented to us before as being problematic.
I think that's a great point, which is why I guess they use that somewhat unique phrase in this policy, and they continue to use it. So, you know, this is something that we need to communicate again to our principals. That would be something we would want to call out and make sure everyone understands that if a student is diagnosed with lice by a school nurse and they have to go through those treatments, which are typically at least 24 hours, that nurse can then help them determine when they can come back.
Okay. And then just my other question is, does the system actually indicate whether the illness was, or the absence was for an illness? So it's my understanding that the absences are recorded as, you know, for example, unexcused, excused, those different things. So are you going to be able to track, oh, yep, there were 3 college trips, and then they went to Disney, and then they did this, and we have all these absences now that have added up to 10, but they weren't technically sick for any of them. Are you going to be able to, just on a practical level, be able to track that?
The Synergy does that. So if you run I forget the number of the report, but if you run a student attendance individual profile report, you get the day, the reason, whether a note was received, whether it was excused, unexcused, whether it tripped in the on-law. So you get all of that in a report. That is inputted by our attendance secretary here, so.
But is it clear, we're not governing to that, we're just going by 10 days, right? So 10 days and then beyond, it doesn't matter as long as it's an excused absence.
Yeah, I'm just answering the question. We can gather that information.
Okay. But it won't change what we're proposing here in the policy. Okay.
So I guess I think that's an interesting question Mrs. Lofton just raised. If we go into the system, it will say excused or unexcused, but it won't necessarily say a student is out for illness. So I think the question is, how do I know if a student is absent 3 consecutive days? Does it say excused due to illness?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sick, or it'll say trip, or it'll say.
Okay. So it will define that. Okay.
You won't have all the paperwork there, but you get the description of what it is.
So it's been input based on the information from the parent. So, okay. So I
There's
guess
a
let's
note
do that.
category. So there's an excusal code, AUX, AEX for excused, unexcused, so there's that column. And then there's another section for notes. So what our attendance secretaries do, they'll put in their note received, or illness, or trip form. So they'll usually make some sort of notation that gives us an idea the reason for the absence. Not formally, you know, in the code, but there is a note section.
And I just wanted to clarify your question, because it has nothing to do with 10. The policy is now stating that in the event there are 3 consecutive days of absence due to an illness, then you need a note from a licensed practitioner of the healing arts.
Beyond 10.
The previous
10. No,
sentence
it's not what it
says all
says.
absences beyond 10 shall
Yeah.
require a note from, a note from a parent. Well, don't all absences require a note from a parent?
No. So hold on. I want to. Let's.
No, beyond
There's some
10.
periods in there. So it's a maximum of 10
Fine.
days of cumulative lawful absences verified by parental notification shall be permitted during the school year. Period. All absences beyond 10 days cumulative shall require a note from a parent. Period. In the event of 3 consecutive days of absences due to illness, a note is required from a licensed practitioner. It has nothing to do with the previous 10 days. If you want to make it that, that's a totally different subject, but that's not what it says.
Yeah, I'm reading it differently from
You
what
gotta-
you said,
Oh.
Dr. Russell.
gotta-
Yeah, and actually, Dr. Weston prompted us to consider how to make this clear. So the question was, okay, if a student's absent 11 days, do they need a note for the 11th day or only those first 10 days? So I think we might want to call out every time a student is absent, we expect a note from a parent, or that educational trip form, if you will.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Mr. Saylor, because I feel like that's redundant with the first sentence of that section, that all absences require a note from a parent.
Yeah, the second sentence that says all absences beyond 10 days shall require a note from parent should be removed. It should just
Yeah,
say a
you don't need
maximum
that.
of 10 days of cumulative lawful absences verified by parental notification shall be permitted during the school year, period. In the event there are 3 consecutive absences due to illness, comma, a note from a licensed practitioner of the healing arts will be required. That should be it. That middle sentence needs to be removed.
Or did you intend it to be a note from a parent? I thought it was going to be, and I made the assumption that it was a note from a practitioner of the healing arts.
So, yeah, so I think it's a really good question, and we need to bring clarity. And this, again, was prompted by a question that I received around when a note is required or not, and does this paragraph confuse that? So how would we say it so that it makes the most sense?
Well, what it is, do you need a note every time you're absent?
You do, or you need an educational trip form, yes.
So that should be it right there. Anytime a student is absent, you need a note. It has nothing to do with minimum of 10 cumulative absences.
So up above, that covers it. Absences shall be treated as unexcused until the district receives a written excuse explaining the absence, or technically an educational trip form to be submitted within 3 days.
Yeah.
You know, the trip is different. I think there's policy around that, separate from this.
There is.
But I think historically, it was after 10 days was when you needed to have a note from a doctor, or.
Right, that's right.
So are we just eliminating that? Like, should this have said licensed practitioner of the healing arts as opposed to parent?
What is the
Dr. Russell, I'd
administration?
like to go back and maybe look at PA school code as well as the back, because in recommendations that we've received from the state, it indicates that school districts must identify the maximum number of days that you will accept as lawful absences in any given school year. Thus, we've arrived at the 10. But the law sort of gives leeway, I'll say. So it indicates you must identify the number of maximum lawful absences you'll allow during any given school year, and then a school district also has latitude to identify when they will require a note for any additional absences. That was the reason for calling out 10 days of cumulative lawful absences allowed in any one school year, and then an attempt to delineate what do we require once those beyond 10 days. Further or elsewhere in the policy, it does call out what happens if, and I think the first sentence says, all absences are treated as unlawful until we receive a written notice within 3 days of an absence. So you're correct, we do require a reason, but there are times where we don't get notices, and that's where we get into truancy, and we talk about 3 unlawful absences, and a letter is generated and sent out to families when we have a student has 3 days of absences with no note, and then again when there's 6 days with no note, a notice goes out, and that prompts a process which again has to do with those student attendance improvement conferences to talk about, are there barriers preventing a child from attending school?
So you could say, after the maximum of 10 unlawful absences or parental notification shall be mandated. You could do that after the 10 unlawful absences.
It would be 10 lawful, just to be clear, it's 10 lawful absences, and then there's a series of reasons why they are considered excused, but they also do require a note to make them.
Yeah, but what happens when you have a student that has 5 absences with no note from a parent?
We would have sent a letter to the family at day 3. Day 4, we would have made a phone call and begun to implement.
But
a
that letter is
conference or-
automatically generated by Harrisburg. So if you're out Monday and then you're out Thursday 3 weeks later, and then you're out Monday 2 weeks later, that's 3 absences without a parental note. That letter gets generated.
Yes.
It's not 3 consecutive.
It is not 3 consecutive. It is just 3 unlawful without written notification or reason within 3 days of the absence.
Correct.
So I apologize, the law does have a lot of different guidelines and different checkpoints. So in our attempt to be clear.
You could say after, go ahead, Dr. Kohler.
So was your intent to just really call out that we're asking for a practitioner's note after 3 consecutive days of illness? Because it sounds like the other stuff was fine. We always required a note. 10 days has always been the threshold, because we're not going to require a doctor's note if someone goes to Disney for 10 days, so we don't want to add that in. You're really just concerned about 3 consecutive days of illness. So I think it's just getting lost in the language, and that needs to be cleaned up a bit.
So what if they're out for 3 consecutive days and the parent is saying it's not an illness? Then they don't need a note from a licensed practitioner.
But the process is that they would still need a note from a parent.
Yeah.
So if it's an educational absence, because otherwise it's unexcused. That's the current process. I guess I'm confused as why there's confusion with the process.
I think it's just the wording. I think
Yeah.
all you're changing is that if it's 3 consecutive illness days,
Right.
we're requiring a note.
After 10.
Right.
And that's required of staff as well, as I understand it, correct? That they need a doctor's note if they're out. So it's just to mirror that
Wait,
language.
Wait, Dr. Kohler and I are trying to clarify something, because there's a period in there, which
I'm
means
so
it's a new
sorry.
sentence.
Yeah.
Do you only want the letter from the licensed practitioner after the 10 absences, or do you just want that in general?
So it is intended to read after a student reaches 10
So
absences.
then maybe we need
That's
a
what I thought.
so why don't you have a colon? So why don't you start out by saying after a maximum of 10 cumulative total absences, colon, the following shall happen, and 1 and 2.
Is that what
Makes
you
sense?
intend also, Dr. Boyd? So you want a doctor's note if they're out for 3 consecutive or more days
After they're 10.
for an illness after the 10 days, right?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yes.
That's not how it was reading, so I agree we need to clarify.
Yeah.
So how about if you help me to know how you'd like to see it revised, if you could review that once more. What are you thinking? A maximum of 10 days of cumulative lawful absence verified by parental notification shall be permitted during a school year. All absences beyond 10 cumulative days shall require a note, from a licensed practitioner of the healing arts whenever an absence is due to illness and is 3 or more consecutive days in duration.
Yes.
Do we need to call out that a parent notification will be needed for any absences beyond 10 days?
So we sort of went through that. I got the feeling that the group felt no, it's not necessary, it's understood because of that first paragraph there, but
Right.
exactly,
Right.
that's right.
Parent note for 1 day, yeah.
So
Yes.
then, but the first, if we don't, so we're saying after 10 days, if you're out sick for 3 days, you need a note. But then the first sentence of that says after 10 days, the first 10 days can be verified by parental notification.
Correct.
Right.
Okay, but then you're saying beyond 10 days, we will also require a note from a parent. But if it's, like, what, I'm not
So the intent is if a student,
following this.
yeah, and so maybe we can work on the language to make it clearer if necessary, but the intent is that if a student accumulates 10 days of absence, that's a lot of days of absence. That's considered a lot of days. If they go beyond that threshold and they happen to be out 3 consecutive days, now we not only want a note from your parent, we want a note from a doctor if it's due to illness. Now, if it's due to a funeral, parents write the note, but we're trying to hold individuals accountable if those absences, continue to accumulate.
So then you don't necessarily need that first sentence of
Correct.
that paragraph,
That's what I said. You don't need it anymore.
correct?
You could, it could just be all absences beyond the 10, that's it.
True.
Mr., yeah, sir?
Just a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Isn't the process, and Ryan, maybe you can, or Mr. Marsh, maybe you can help on this. If a child is out 3 consecutive days before reaching 10, isn't a doctor's note required?
I thought it was.
if they're out, if a child's out 3 consecutive days,
Yeah, I believe that's how the law reads too. I believe.
The answer is yes.
I thought they were required.
They are,
Maybe.
'cause
Yeah. Because the spirit of that, as I understand it,
'Cause
through
I've
the
had to get
law
that.
is that if a kid does not show up to school for 3 days and you don't have an indication of where they are, you have a potential safety issue on your hands. So that's why. That's my understanding of it. What's that?
Parent sent a note for 3 consecutive days. But you only need a doctor's note if you're talking about an
Illness.
extended illness.
Yeah.
And so if you don't declare an illness, you don't need a doctor's note.
Right.
Yeah, but then the school wants to know. Then the school comes out.
I understand. I'm
Yeah.
just, simple way to game the system.
Right.
Well,
Great, Aunt
as soon as you
Susie.
hit 15, no.
Yeah.
10,
Yeah, but 15 is when we're gonna request a conference, right?
correct. Is everyone okay with the new language that's up on the screen? All absences beyond 10 cumulative days shall require a note from a licensed practitioner of the healing arts whenever absence due to illness and a 3 or more consecutive days in duration. I mean, it hits what you're trying to look for.
So to Mr. Marsh's point, oh, yep, nope, we were in Disney. Sorry, I forgot to send in, my trip approval form. So sorry. We'll be back next week. Why would I bother hunting down telling you my child's sick and hunting down a doctor's note?
Well, that would be unexcused though, right? So like, I'm reading this as if there's an extended illness, then we're gonna
Yeah, it's
have some compassion and possibly some
Right, right.
leeway. But if a parent's saying, oh, we're in Disney, well then that's unexcused. You've been gone more than 10 days.
But that's not what our policy is saying.
Mm-hmm. If you go away and you forget to fill out the form,
If you go, but then you send a note.
yeah. It's unexcused absence.
Oh, because it goes back to the reasons for which absences can be excused.
Huh.
Okay.
Disney class trip,
Right.
Disney family trip.
So some level of gaming could still be,
Right.
But we can't worry about
but we can't worry about it. Right.
that. Any other, since there's no other changes in this, any other questions with this? Okay. Any objections to moving this ahead? Okay. We'll move on to 705.1.
Okay, so I wanted to let the committee know, I know that we've been spending a lot of time and having some rich conversation around the policies connected to introducing school police officers. There are 5 policies that are included on the agenda from here on, and each of them has been reviewed by our solicitor, and the feedback, there was a little bit of that, has been incorporated into the policies. So, Mr. Miller, Mr. Weaver, and I are prepared to speak to any questions that individuals might have. I'll pull up the policies, and we can sort of quickly review them. If we begin with 705.1, since first reading, we have made some revisions. We changed safety supervisor to chief of police, since that is anticipated to be Mr. Miller's new title. The other addition that I want to call out is from the solicitor. It's on the screen right now. To conduct investigations of alleged violations under the school district jurisdiction. So this is an addition that was recommended as a number 3 under delegation of responsibility. So that is different. That's new. The other language is consistent with what the committee has seen before.
Any questions on 705.1? Okay.
So the other thing I want to, if I could, Mr. Saylor, there was a question about policy that exists currently that prohibits school employees from bringing personally owned firearms or ammunition onto school property. So 705.1, and this is a topic that we've discussed, we are intending in the policy language to have school police officers employed by the district only have their district-issued firearm. They will be provided a safe lockbox for storage when that firearm is at home, and they are not permitted to carry their personal weapon or have it on school property. Per policy 218.1, nor are students permitted. It's called out in the policy to have weapons on school property. So there was a question about other individuals who are on school property, and if we go to policy 907, and we are under Under 907, delegation of responsibility, the first statement references state and federal laws. Policy 904 and I want to find the statement that references Thank you. Third line under authority. So there was a question about individuals coming onto school property. Third line under authority. It's actually the second statement. The board prohibits gambling, except for small games of chance and the possession and use of controlled substances prohibited by state or federal law, alcoholic beverages, and weapons on school premises. Now, we have also learned from our solicitor that if individuals have a concealed carry permit and they carry for a lawful purpose, there is some question about that. So this gets gray under the law. However, there is a statement in an existing policy that does reference that, and that was a question that was posed to me. So I wanted to make the committee aware of that.
Makes sense to me. I don't think you need to change it because you address it right there. You can't address the conceal or, lawful use of a weapon.
It's also mentioned in 707 for rentals. So if someone were to rent, it's also a part of that agreement.
Any questions on 705-1?
Yeah, just one more. I didn't see anywhere where it was explicitly laid out that the officers can bring their weapons home. It's implied. Shouldn't it just be stated somewhere in there? So that's an observation and for consideration.
Hold on.
It's implied in several spots, but it doesn't say you can bring because you're not permitted to bring your own weapon. But it also doesn't say you can bring and should bring your weapon home. I think it should say that.
Oh, we had that in there.
It's implied. I couldn't find it, so if somebody says I'm wrong, I love being told I'm wrong.
So I don't read, under guidelines number 2, it says a district-issued firearm is to be stored at home. I mean,
Right.
I don't think that's an implication. I think that's a direction that's where they should
I was
keep
gonna say
it.
that's
It says when a district-issued firearm is stored at the home, it should be in a locked box or a district-issued safe storage box. So again, it's still somewhat implied if you bring it home, which you could imply from that you can bring it home. I think it should just be stated explicitly, number 1, somewhere. Also, it says accepted instead of
Certainly add that.
expected.
You're reading it from a printout. It
Yeah,
doesn't-
I'm reading
on
from
the
a printout.
screen, I see that that was corrected.
Yeah,
That's
thank
all.
you. You're right. I would call it out. I'm just saying. It's up to you.
So maybe it goes in the procedural guidelines, because this is saying it's calling upon the chief of police to provide direction and
Yeah.
requirements for these specific things. So maybe within the guidelines, it can then be explicit that they may bring the weapon home, since it's saying that the chief of police will have guidelines for use, maintenance, and
Yeah.
storage.
I'm fine with that.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions on 705-1?
Nope.
Okay. Any objections to continuing to move that forward? Okay. 02? Or 705.2?
So this policy talks about school police incidents and gets into the specifics of interviewing students, and we did add a passage about Miranda rights as brought up by the committee previously, and there's an administrative reg and a waiver that will be presented. There was a question about, can a minor student waive their rights, or how are they handled when it comes to Miranda rights? So I'll let Mr. Miller speak to that a little bit. Right now, our practice is anytime a student is going to be interviewed by a police officer, we contact the parent and we invite the parent in, or we offer in loco parentis if they're unable to make it, if it's their choice. But we always offer that as our practice. So I don't know if you want to add any more to that, Mr. Miller, about
And
Miranda rights.
That's the basis of that interaction, especially with a juvenile student. And quite frankly, we'll treat all students as a juvenile. They're in our care. We're responsible to the parents, so we'll make that notification. We'll offer them the opportunity to be here or to at least have them represented. I will say that if it is an incident of discipline, it would not involve school police at all. So that would be something where there would not be any engagement. That would be responsibility of the administrative team as it currently stands, and we don't want to mesh the two. So we want to make sure that they're very different when it comes to any kind of interaction that is done with regards to questioning them about what might be criminal activity. And that is where Miranda plays a role. So that was spelled out in here. The waiver calls out the notifications. And again, as Dr. Russell said, our solicitor looked it over. It meets the acceptable standards that are utilized when we're discussing such matters with juveniles and law enforcement of any agency. So,
Any questions?
Yeah,
Mr. Cohen?
I do. Go ahead.
Going a little bit further, on page 3, there's a strike for intoxicated individuals of the entire paragraph there. Why was that done?
when it came to the, I'm sorry. You want to go ahead?
I was just going to reference back to previous conversation where there was a question about why is that the only offense, if you will, that's been called out in the policy? Is it necessary? And so we struck it because it's assumed and it's covered really with other offenses that might occur on school property. I don't know if there's anything else to add to that.
No, it
Right,
is.
and it's,
Go ahead.
yes, disciplinary, as Ms. White is pointing out.
Right. So if it becomes a criminal matter where there'd be issuance of a summary citation, let's say, to an individual who was non-cooperative, wouldn't leave the premise, a belligerent, intoxicated person, that would be an issue where state law would supersede whatever policy we had in any regard, and then the citation would be issued under that authority.
Well,
So-
it also says under the influence of a controlled substance.
Right, again,
So somebody could be unreasonable at that point. Does it become a matter of the police, or does it
could be,
become a matter of
could
the
be. If we're dealing
administration?
with, obviously, again, if we're dealing with a student, we're going to defer to the discipline process that's in place with administration. If it's a parent, non-cooperative visitor on campus at a sporting event or an activity, then it could be dealt with by law enforcement that's here, or if it's at a point in time when law enforcement's not present, we would call an outside authority to come. So, but it could very well be, a law enforcement piece where state law, again, would supersede a policy.
Just seems odd that that would be removed, considering it was already in the policy.
Russ, you had a question?
Yeah, just to follow up Mr. Cohen's comments. Previously, though, the way that it was written, it would have been a disciplinary action. So we're saying that it could still start as a disciplinary action, and it would be the school's discretion based on the disciplinary.
Correct.
regs to determine if it should become.
Right.
We don't want to create a, you know, a pipeline to prison, in
Right,
other words.
we
right?
don't, you know,
Okay.
I
I'm good
hesitate
with that.
to use the term, but just for understanding, you don't want to have a police state where every matter becomes a police issue,
That's right.
so.
Mr. Cohen, to your question, this portion of the policy is already in place elsewhere. If a student is walking around with a beer or intoxicated, Mr. Marsh, if it was saying it's at the high school, right? Mr. Marsh is gonna take care of that. The administration is gonna take care of that.
3 times I dealt with that at Skip Back. No. Just kidding, Dr. Russell, sorry.
Now,
They drink vodka.
Check that Kool-Aid.
I apologize.
the controlled substance was more of my concern than the intoxication.
And the way we have controlled substance defined within other policy, it's very broad. So it can be any substance that's under the regulation of a doctor. It might necessarily have to be a particular controlled substance from the Drug Act. It could be prescribed medication improperly used. It could be tobacco-related products that, you know, are generally purchased in the common area. So we referred back, again, after some conversation about established policies that were already in place.
Any other questions on
Thank
O2? Yeah.
So to the point made with regard to the fact that it exists appropriately in a disciplinary conduct, is it worthwhile then to cross-reference it similar to the way the Narcan line is cross-referenced to the board policy 823? Well, I'm saying that you can, if you wanted to leave intoxicated individuals, it can be a statement that reads something along the lines of, should there be an issue with this?
With controlled substances and
Right, student
intoxicating.
code of conduct, policy, blah, 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 shall be the first line of,
Yeah.
because I mean, I would assume since issues have come up with controlled substances, at a certain point, there's a decision whether or not to inform the state police at this point. Like there's a certain policy in place, a process.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And you know, more broadly, in all my time, the approaches have changed from that zero tolerance days, which were to really more of an effort to the vehicle to get the help needed, and really balancing the safety of the community with the needs of the individual and making sure you're covering both of those and however you proceed with it. So it's changed a little bit, not to get us off on a tangent,
No,
but that's
restorative.
our approach have changed in the way we dealt with it from times past.
Understood, but I mean, if the offense were to be something like, for example, the sale of, then that would require a different line of
Right.
decision-making. So I just am wondering if there should just be a cross-reference. If someone's looking into this policy incidents, that they can be led to.
Well, are they going to be carrying Narcan? I mean, so 823 makes it legal for the school to purchase, stock, and then administer. Are police officers, or the SPOs going to have it on them just in case?
So we're going to have it available in the buildings for anyone, you
Yeah,
know, to
that's-
access. Nursing staff, they'll be trained with the use of it,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
So I think if I'm hearing Ms. White correctly, a statement could be under intoxicated individuals, should there be an issue with a controlled substance
You could just mention
or
the
intoxicated individuals, the student code of conduct will be referenced first
Yeah.
prior to.
Like, in other words, the chain of command should be that police will only be involved at the discretion of administration based on policy, blah, 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 whatever it is, number that exists so far. Like, in other words, to me, there should be, to the point about the pipeline, there should be some sort of a caveat that says that there won't be involvement based on what Mr. Miller is saying, unless it is at the discretion or, decision of administration. And then it addresses the fact that, should it warrant it, the police could be involved.
Right.
But that is not the purpose of the police in this building. to.
Dr. Kohler, you had a,
So I guess my question is, are we going to reintegrate this section into the policy because, or are we leaving it and recognizing that it's addressed comprehensively in other areas?
I think that's up to the committee. I mean, do we want to call it out and be explicit? Should there be an issue with a controlled substance or an intoxicated individual, the student code of conduct will be referenced first. School police will become involved at the discretion of administration.
So, okay.
That's what I've noted.
If we're going to bring it back, I would just say that if somebody is under the influence of a controlled substance, the first step that I would think would be to have a nursing assessment and ensure that, you know, to determine whether any health interventions need to take place. That, you know, it's
that's
not.
the current policy, yeah.
Right, that, yeah, so it shouldn't be up, you know, the initial referral isn't to the principal, it's to the nurse.
I can add that if the committee, if the
If
committee
we're
would like
putting
to
this
do that.
back in,
Yeah.
which I'm not sure how people feel on that. But the question that I had about when we talked about it before was the last line, that intoxicated individuals shall be arrested. If we keep it, I would think it should be may be arrested, not that, oh, you're intoxicated, therefore you must be arrested. It's
Yeah.
more of a behavioral assessment.
Mr.
If
Marsh?
if it's an adult at a football game who happens to be intoxicated,
Yeah, and then in that scenario, in school with a student, that's going to be at the discretion of the police officer themselves. I've actually never had a student arrested in front of me in school, right, and placed in the vehicle, like not what you would think of. Those two options and really a third option of technically, which I've never seen, the police officer could take them. They don't do that. I've never seen them do that. But they'll come in and they'll say, and Dean, correct me if I'm wrong, here's what our policy says. They'll do what they need to do to address the situation from a police standpoint. Sometimes they, take our input on that, with that,
So those arrests typically occur via summons. So the police come, they investigate, they take their information, they go back, process the paperwork, and simply mail a citation,
Yeah.
in this case, to the defendant, whoever it may be. And we could even have that process where you're talking about may or shall. Same thing with an adult. We have them removed from the site and, calm the situation down, can mail them a citation later.
Yeah, go ahead.
In just reviewing the policy, I'm not certain it is necessary to keep that section in there, since it has already been stricken. Because up above it says reporting incidents to police officers, which numbers
Yeah, alcohol, tobacco.
14 and 15 are covered, which then also reference their policies as 222 and 227.
Correct.
Which have their own guidelines. So I believe because it's there, it wouldn't be necessary to include it even with a statement of referring it back to policy.
Already there. Mr. Cohen, you're nodding in approval? Okay, anyone else?
Yeah.
Ms. White, does that work, because it's already there?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
So does that read the way that we would like it? Reporting incidents to police officers, the following incidents will be referred to the police for investigation. That includes alcohol, tobacco, vaping, controlled substances.
They
Are we all comfortable with that?
They always are. If you have a student that goes down and has to be given, Narcan, and that gets taken out by an ambulance, isn't there a follow-up from the county?
If a student has consumed alcohol, Mr. Marsh, are the police always called or contacted?
Our handbook now says that we do refer it to the police, yeah.
For alcohol, tobacco, and vaping?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
So I guess with any of these, I mean, some of them are more serious than others,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
I guess my overall concern is just, it's the will versus the may, or the shall versus the may. I just think that there needs to be some discretion. I mean, okay, rape and arson are pretty clear cut, but I just think that there should be some discretion about some of the instances where a student would potentially have an offense and have it not be a police offense.
So, with regards to that, and if we want to add or change the line here, we could refer back to the MOU, which would have to exist regardless if the police department is our own or outside. That would reference the two separate pieces of the MOU. One is a mandatory required, which is where some of these come from,
Right,
and others are discretionary.
right.
So we could simply refer back to the MOU as well with regards to this list,
Right.
which would open all those up to be just compliant to what the MOU is and leave the rest to our discretion.
Right. I just don't think that power and authority should be taken away from administration and the buildings.
No, I agree with you.
Mr. Larson?
Yeah, my question pertains to the first page under interviewing students.
Okay.
We could go back to that. Okay, so it says on the first paragraph that the building principal or designate or the student's parents or guardians, and the student's parents or guardians will be notified. So then two more paragraphs down, it says that the police officers shall inform the student questioned of their Miranda rights. Warnings will be acknowledged by the suspect as being understood, and those rights clearly waived prior to interrogation. So, you know, there's a constitutional right to not self-incriminate. Okay, Miranda just upheld that in the 70s. Students can't consent to waiving their rights without their parents. It's not written that way. This has to be written in a way that says the parents have to be part of waiving their rights. Period.
Right.
So I think that has to be changed.
So that was my question too. I know you said, Mr. Miller, that we always call the parents and we try to get them to be there, but if they can't be there, can you move forward and allow a minor to waive their rights? And
No.
then that needs to be stated, I think.
It has to be rewritten.
That's not been the case.
This is one area of the law that I know very well.
So, Mr. Larson, do you have a suggestion, or Mr. Miller, on how that should be stated more
Well,
accurately?
hold on, I want to, no difference to either or. He's not a lawyer. You said Subers reviewed everything, correct?
He did.
I sent questions about Miranda, didn't get any responses. So, is this, if Subers, the lawyer reviewed this, correct?
He did.
Okay. I sent over a couple questions about Miranda, didn't get any responses. Spoke to a couple chief of police locally about it. So I disagree with what you just said, because there are differences when Miranda's not even needed. Maybe he's talking to, not to mean the point, but a principal is talking. You don't have an SPO, there's a criminal act at the school, a principal is talking. They don't necessarily have to give Miranda. There is questions about when someone is considered to be in custody. So if the lawyer reviewed this and the lawyer said that's okay, then we need to, understand that.
Yeah, but you're interpreting, but this is specifically speaking to Miranda and interrogating students who have waived their Miranda rights, and Mr. Suber should look at it again. Now, I'm just making my recommendation. It clearly needs to stay on here. It can say, and it can be added in here very easily, in my opinion, where it would say a student can waive their right with parental consent, or
It
a
says
parent
here,
and student
it
would
says
waive
here in the law, juveniles are free to waive or give up their Miranda rights so long as they understand the rights and the consequences of waiving them.
Right.
Court cases, North Carolina versus Butler. Juveniles' age, education levels, intelligence comes into effect, the time of the day, the length of questioning, tone of the questioning. There are a lot of legalities where a student can waive their Miranda rights.
Yeah, and you're looking up cases on the fly.
No,
I can look up cases
on
and
the
show you
fly.
that they've been appealed and overturned, that minor children cannot waive their rights to they are not of the age of consent and cannot waive their rights, and that would be upheld.
I'll just
on
say
appeal.
practically, we don't allow them to waive their rights now.
Right. I was
We
just
don't
gonna
allow
say
them to
that.
do
Right,
that.
so I'm saying it should
So
just be
we make
codified.
sure we have a parent there, or we have consent to have the officer in. And I'd say in 98% of the cases, the parents say, wait till I get there.
Yeah, but
You
that's
know.
your understanding, but if it's not codified.
No, I'm not
legally-
questioning your effort. I'm just saying, I'm just giving you the context. This is what we practically do
This is how
now.
it works.
Yes.
So that would be a change from what our community's accustomed to.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem adding that.
So the statement I have, and help me to know that it's reflecting what we're discussing or accurately reflecting what it is you're thinking. A student can waive their rights with parental consent or only with parental consent. And I'll elaborate and include Miranda rights. And I'll have Mr. Subers review it again
Okay.
Right.
if we incorporate it. And then it'll be ready. If this is going to move forward to the board, we'll send it to you with notes. We'll talk to Mr. Subers.
Fair enough.
And Mr. Miller, are you okay with that as well?
I am.
Yep.
Thank you.
Any other questions on, Dr. Curlow, you had a question, but was it
No,
that?
that, I had the same question actually, so thank
Okay.
you.
All right, so you'll send updates to the committee and board for it to be reviewed at the next board meeting?
Yep.
Okay.
And I'll send it with the notes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's great. 805 point, oh, we just did that. Nope. 805.2. It's clunky today. We're gonna talk about that.
So, a couple of things to call out here, and I mentioned them in the notes of the agenda. Our solicitor, the phrase school security officers is not, it does not appear in school code. We either work with school police officers, school resource officers, or school security guards. The recommendation was to change officers to guards, and we had already changed guards to officers, so that terminology has been changed back. And I really think that was one of the few changes that were recommended here. I don't know if there are other questions on this policy. This one's been looked at a little bit more than the 700s, so I'm not certain if there are questions at this point after individuals have had more time to review. That was the big change, or the number of revisions that appear here.
Anyone have any questions? Okay. We'll move on. We'll move that through. 834. Where did you go? Where did you go? There you are.
Okay, so there was a question about this policy as well, and I want to call that out. And speaking with Mr. Miller and Mr. Weaver, the question was, why is taser, physical force, under the use of force continuum, listed above empty-handed control or physical force? So administration is recommending we switch those in that order, that vertical order, and move empty-handed control above taser.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you look at, let me enlarge this a little bit. If we go down the policy to the use of force continuum, which is under parameters for use of non-deadly force, there seems to be some of those different examples of force listed in a vertical order. And the question posed was, why do you have tasers, which is number 3, above empty-handed control or physical force? And so that certainly makes sense to us to switch those so that it is a more logical and appropriate flow when we talk about force.
Dr. Russell, I'll be indifferent to ultimately what the committee thinks here, but I thought the way it was written, it was fine then being in the order it was in the continuum, because it says that it can be used before or after empty-handed control, depending on the type and degree of resistance being encountered. So I wouldn't want to, corner an officer into having to go empty-handed when they didn't feel that they could or should go empty-handed. They should go right to taser. I don't know if there'd be circumstances like that, but I thought that the way it was written allowed some flexibility there.
Right, so there's been professional debate about the order of things in the use of force continuum for many years. The underlying response to that is it's whatever force is appropriate for the circumstance. So you might arrive at a circumstance that is instantaneously something where you're going to go to the taser, you're going to skip over everything else that's already there for whatever reason, and a variety of other circumstances that would, dictate a different response. It's not, while, in a perfect scenario, it would go from one to the next in a progression. Many circumstances don't permit that to happen. So these in particular were just simply listed as those types of force that we're discussing. And, the appropriate one, we somewhat had them laid out in a continuous form, if you would. But flipping either one of those back or forth, really, it doesn't lock us into a responsibility to go one way or the other.
Mr. Liggett? Oh, sorry. Mr. Liggett, then Dr. Kohler.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it seemed like these were set up as a definition rather than trying to be the actual continuum. But I don't see any issue, considering it isn't like they're alphabetical, by switching them and actually following it. I had one question, and this is for Mr. Miller here, about the verbal commands, saying it delineates here that the use of profanity or disrespectful or argumentative conduct on the part of a officer is unacceptable. Basically, we're saying that our police officers can't curse. Wouldn't that be considered part of the spectrum on that level there? I mean, to me, I think a police officer using a well-timed profanity would be preferential to going to a physical force. Do we really want to limit our police officers' ability to use words?
I don't know that this is limiting, but more of a guidance to say you attract more bees with your sweetness than your bitterness, kind of thing. But
the reason I say that is because it almost seems as if in a situation where our police officer were to use profanity during an incident,
right,
according to this, it's unacceptable. Would we be writing up the police officer for dropping an F-bomb?
I wouldn't see myself doing that unless, of course, it was a continued course of conduct. But in the stressfulness of a high stress event, I could see it happening.
But I would think that our goal would be to have our police officers communicate in a professional manner
Oh,
and not
absolutely.
wind up
Oh, that's absolutely the goal
exacerbating
here.
and escalating the
Right.
situation. So while they might inadvertently let something slip that they shouldn't, I wouldn't want to have a police officer implementing curse words as a way to try to gain control of a situation.
I would agree. I mean, from an HR perspective, we would absolutely address, that conduct. Now, how it's addressed would be dependent on the situation that it occurred in. However, it would need to be addressed because we do expect all employees to act in a professional manner, which would not include use of profanities, argumentative with students, or any derogatory comments being made.
Would the word, instead of unacceptable, discouraged, or would you prefer it to remain as unacceptable?
I
would-
prefer
Unacceptable.
unacceptable.
Yeah, I would prefer as unacceptable.
I
That's
prefer
fine.
unacceptable, yeah.
I
I
just want to
understand
make
your
sure that
point.
we're landing in the same place here.
Yeah, mhm.
Because I understand as a professional matter, you're right. We don't want to encourage this in any way. But in here, in the same way, I mean, as long as there's flexibility in the enforcement of it on the police officer, I wouldn't, I'm fine with that.
I mean, it's not saying it's a felony for them to say it, but it's
No,
not
but it's officially
what
unacceptable.
we want them doing.
Unacceptable. And if it happens,
And it'll be dealt with.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's addressed in 705.1.
There are a lot of things that are unacceptable.
It's already in
Yeah.
705.1,
Yeah.
so.
Any other questions on 830? Yeah, 834. Oh, Dr. Huller, yes.
I had a question about the tasers. And forgive me if I don't really know these things. Do they automatically, all of these officers, carry their own tasers? Are we supplying district-issued tasers?
No, that would be equipment that we would supply, train them on.
Okay, so is
have
that
them.
something that they have to store? Are they allowed to keep those on them at all times?
So they would be part of their equipment that's issued to them to carry when they're working, and then the storage of it, excuse me, would be on them initially. And as we develop these storage areas for them, they would be kept in those locations.
Thought I was going to go the whole meeting without coughing.
Mr. Miller, I'm sorry. Mr. Miller, would you expect that they would store a taser or, I don't know if they have anything else that that is construed as a weapon like that. Would they store that in the lockbox that the district will provide along with their firearm when at home?
They could, absolutely, yeah.
So we could include that in the administrative reg to make it more explicit.
Right.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be helpful because I hadn't really thought about tasers until I started reading through this and felt like it should be treated similarly to their other weapons.
Ms. White?
So I think this particular policy is the one that I have the most concern about with regard to the parameters for any type of force. In that, you know, as Mr. Miller had alluded, we're not looking to move towards a police state. And so I'm just trying to understand at what point a decision would need to be made to use any type of force on a child in a building, aside from words, or a principal perhaps breaking up a fight.
Right.
Like why there would need to be a taser drawn on a child. What type of situation would warrant that?
If there was dangerous behavior, someone's subjected to potentially serious bodily injury, that would call for the use of a taser. There are different circumstances depending on what is happening, where training will play a big role in not only that discretion, but that maintaining composure, if you will, under those circumstances, and knowing that we're dealing with emotionally charged youth here that are engaging in these kinds of things. And we'll take a lot of lead from the people who practice it the most, which are our principals in the district, with regards to that. So I wouldn't see it being the the choice to have it, but if it were a choice between that and a handgun, I would prefer they go to the taser if there's no
Well,
other gunplay.
And to that point, you know, respectfully, I think in like the world, society, you know, a taser at a traffic stop that goes wrong is a preference to a handgun, right? Like that makes sense. So I'm just wondering that, you know, for the administrators and teachers at the table, has there ever been in your career a time where you felt as though a police officer with a taser was necessary to control or break up a disciplinary action in a building? That it was so severe that that should even be, like, discretion is fine, but discretion is subjective. And so my concern with that is that I just feel as though the idea of, especially a very distressed situation, that a taser would even be considered.
It's a tool, just like everything else that
So do you have a problem if your son is in a severe and violent altercation in a building that he should be tasered?
I rely on police officers to make the right decision in order to protect the staff and the students in the school.
So at what level would that be warranted? What would the individual be doing that they would need to be tased? Yeah, me too. I would like to hear from Mr. Marsh as well.
I mean, for me, it would be, I'm sorry.
So, been in administration since 2001. 2 times in that time I have felt unsafe in my own office or in the office area, and only 1 time was that a student. The other time it was a parent. I've never used a taser. I've never been tased. I have no experience with them. So for me to say what would be the threshold would be a hard answer because I've never done that. I would say that when we talk about the things that I'm trained in, which is de-escalation strategies and ultimately safe holds if needed, is that verbal de-escalation is the number one thing that we try to do. We talk to kids about if you're a danger to yourself or a danger to others. Those are some of the trip points that we're looking for to potentially, put hands on someone if needed. But I really can't say where that threshold, I don't mean to dodge the statement. I would say this informally, the one time I had a very irate parent in my office at West, that seemed like in hindsight, that could have been a time when I could have used that kind of support. So potentially, right? So, but that's about it in my time. I hope that helps.
It absolutely does. And I guess to my point about that, should there have been an SPO at West in that incident, in that instance rather, you would have called for them as backup, say for example. They would have then started from the baseline of de-escalation, meaning verbal commands or all of these other things. Police presence would probably be the first one. You would have called them in, and that probably would have put an end to whatever behavior the parent was exhibiting. So in my mind, I don't know what the situation was, but in other words, once a police officer is present, then it's kind of like, oh, no, wait a second, I don't want any trouble type of thing. So I feel like that would have been enough. So again, I go back to the question of, in terms of discipline for children in our buildings, why are any of these things, like to me a taser, if there's an intruder in the building, go for it. Handgun, go for it. Whatever you need to do to keep the building safe. But as far as a disciplinary reason for children, I don't see that there is a place for this in our buildings.
No.
So
And I wouldn't see it used as a disciplinary tool. Let's just put that out there. It's
But
not,
that's what, I understand that that's what you're agreeing, that's what you're saying, but to me, this reads as though it's a justification for use in certain instances.
and there are that may present themselves. And I'll just give you a real-time example here, the current events. If 2 subjects, students or not, are engaged in a physical fight, and someone's choking someone to the point they're not going to let go, so a taser can be used in a fashion, it's called a dry stun. So I'm not going to deploy the probes from across the way and drop that person, but what I might do is drive the taser, the front end butt of that taser, into a muscle group so they let go of that hold, so that they're not choking the person, or so they're not clamped onto something they shouldn't have their hands on, or whatever it might be. So there's different ways to deploy it. One of the other ways to deploy it is simply take the cap off and let it make its sound for the sake of having people realize this person has a taser, I could be next, I need to stop what I'm doing, much like the presence you talk about. So there are different ways to deploy it, but I wouldn't be using that as the forefront for discipline with the kids unless it was absolutely necessary.
Can I?
Hold on 1 second.
Oh, sorry.
I'll just share from my experience, and I would say unfortunately had these experiences where a student had a loaded weapon in his backpack and police were present. When the police were giving directions, the student lunged for his backpack. I would expect at that point that the police officer is going to use some type of force to stop that student from going to his backpack. Second incident, a student yielding a knife. Thankfully, took direction from the police officer and put the weapon down. Had that student not and lunged at someone, I would expect not the use of a gun, but use of maybe a taser at that point. And those are 2 examples that I've had experience with in administration. So it's possible, that these things can and will occur. Hopefully they don't. But I think those are examples as where possibly a taser might be used to ensure the safety of not only the person that is committing the offense, but anybody else that's in that area.
Mr. Larson, then Ms. Lofton.
Yeah, you said it pretty eloquently with the hypotheticals and then the real world situations. And I was going to say that I felt like that's how it's outlined here in the in the policy in terms of, non-deadly force to protect himself, herself, or another individual from physical harm. So in the hypothetical where a police presence was enough, hey, that's great. But then if the student were to escalate, which you just gave examples of, that's when those other forces in the continuum would be utilized.
Ms. Lofton.
So my thinking on this is that it goes back to the introduction in the policy under authority, where we say it is the policy of the Perkman Valley School District that police officers shall use only that force that is reasonably necessary to effectively bring an incident under control while protecting the lives of officers and others. So I think that sort of preamble to all the other things that we're talking about establishes that that's the only time that force should be used. And maybe it should explicitly say force is never to be used as a consequence for a behavior, I don't know if that wording, how that specific wording was established, but it's only the force that is reasonably necessary to effectively bring an incident under control is that's sort of the crux of what we're talking about. So I don't know if there's other language that needs to be applied there to further clarify that this is never intended to be used as a consequence. Like,
Well, it doesn't say that, does it?
right, no, it doesn't explicitly say that it's never to be used as a consequence. I think, again, it's implied because we're saying you only use it to the extent necessary to bring an incident under control.
Right. Otherwise, you can't use it. So therefore, it couldn't be used as a punitive.
Right. And and of course it's subjective, but we can't foresee every possible situation and every possible variable that could be in play. And I think, to me, that's,
You're not gonna, a student picks
yeah.
up a chair and throws it at a teacher, SPO's not coming in and tasing the student, correct? Student picks up a chair and throws it at the teacher, SPO comes in, they're not tasing the student, correct?
No, because the event at that point's over.
Correct. Student punches another student, they're not tasing the student, correct?
We're at a lower level of force at that point.
Yeah. So we understand that the process for a taser, whether it's for
It
an
has-
adult
Right.
or whether it's for a current student or someone on campus, would be to prevent some form of bodily harm or some form of mental harm to somebody else
In the moment.
in
Sig-
that
There's a
moment.
significant risk factor that's
Correct.
presenting
that
itself, whatever
individual,
that might be.
that SPO is thoroughly trained for, obviously to first de-escalate. Any other questions on this? Any objections to moving forward? All right, we'll move on to the last one of the day, 834.1. Which is a reporting tool.
Right, so this policy, thank you, Mr. Saylor, this policy really describes the guidelines for reporting, and we talked about a few administrative regs in our Safety and Operations ad hoc meeting, where we would record the use of force on a particular form. And in working with Mr. Ganesh, actually, there were questions from our ad hoc committee conversations about storing this information electronically so that we could run reports and that we could monitor ourselves around the sorts of students or staff members, adults in our community where there may be force used. And Mr. Ganesh believes that we can develop a report that can be completed electronically and then be used as part of a larger reporting system in Synergy or in one of our systems. I don't know if you have anything to add, but that was really something that was a takeaway from the ad hoc, and I think will be very practical moving forward.
No, go ahead.
The only thing I was going to add is
Yeah.
the only thing I was going to add is it'll be appropriate for this information to be in the student information system. This way, when whoever is reporting this information would be able to access all of the students' information. If there's a custody issue or whatnot, all information related to the student is within that system. So we don't have to look into a system outside of Synergy. It'll be this information will be within Synergy itself, and if this needs to be reported to the state, that information is right there.
So how would you be able to slice the information then? What categories are you looking to make sure that they're able to ascertain?
So there's a discipline module in Synergy where, I mean, you're talking about the reporting of,
The reporting of incidents. So for example, if the question came up from the board or the community as to how many students were on free and reduced lunch that had reportable incidents, or how many students were X minority, or
Right.
how many, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I think that when we had this conversation in the ad hoc, one of the things that I thought of were looking for potential patterns of behavior as not only a tool for the students in tracking the incidents themselves, but also for the actual SPOs to hold them accountable for any potential bias or discrimination they may be exhibiting in how they execute their function.
so again, that's one of the reasons why we should have this information in Synergy, because in Synergy we do have a demographics, we do have record all kind of demographics of a student, which we can run reports on. If we to run reports on what happens with a specific demographic or a specific school, we can really break it down. If it's a free and reduced, or if it's a certain race, we can definitely break it down and see the number of incidents, or to see if there's any disproportion there.
Disproportion, right?
Yes, we can definitely do that within Synergy. Yes.
Okay, good.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none. Any objections to moving that forward as well? Okie dokie. Comments from the audience? Give the timer when you have a chance. Just, can you just turn that on?
Ah, there it goes. Got my hearing aids turned all the way up, so it was kind of loud. I thought it was on. Okay. Wade Weston, Collegeville Borough, thanks for the opportunity to speak. I appreciated the information that was presented tonight. A lot of the questions that I had were covered. There were some other questions that I had that haven't really been addressed yet. When you were going through the discussion of the use of the taser and the use of force curriculum, a lot of that pertains, I think, or would come into how the kind of training that SPOs would need to receive before starting employment as SPOs with the district. I had a number of questions about that I haven't heard addressed that, and I'm just there's a lot of specific areas that need to be covered, and just the timing of the training, the content of the training, who provides the training. All of this, I think, is something that the community would like to hear. I think that the board should consider going forward as you're preparing to implement this program. I hope this will be the topic of either a further policy meeting or a safety and ops ad hoc meeting if you're still going to conduct those. That's all I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Shona McGee, Skippack Township. There was a lot of really good information tonight. I appreciate all the questions and the talking amongst it. There were some questions that I do have that were not answered tonight. When you were speaking of an interview between a student and one of our school law enforcement, and you were saying that if the in locus parentis is needed, would the parent be able to choose or delegate which administrator or teacher is to act as loco parentis? And is this written or stated anywhere in policy? A lot of the use of talk and force and use of force continuum, where is it defined the use of force continuum is entered into play? What specific training will the police force have on using empty-handed control, which is a physical force in regards to harm reduction, such as CPI training? Extending on what Mrs. Lofton said as far as disciplinary action, I believe that it was said that administrators are responsible for disciplinary actions, but where does the line sit when a police officer would be disciplinarian? It should be stated that any force used is not disciplinary, but to gain control of an actual dangerous situation or to de-escalate it to a manageable incident. I think there should be a very strict policy regarding district-issued weapons, where they are kept, where they are stored, and a strict policy and guidance on when a weapon is drawn on a child. And I haven't heard or seen anywhere where there's a strict policy on that. As far as the electronic reports being accessible, I really love that idea, but how transparent will these reports be with the members of our district with obtaining privacy? Will there be available for public, but withholding names, or just saying the incidences that force was used by our police force? I think that would be something that people in our district would like to know, like how many incidents of force have been used as far as the police force that have been initiated here. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Ms. McGee, if I may, Ms. McGee, I wonder if you would send me those in writing
Absolutely.
via email. That would
Yeah.
be helpful because I wasn't able to keep up, but I really appreciate your points.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
send it right to you now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Sir?
Hi, my name's Aspen Bradley, Skippack Township. America. What do you think of when you hear the word America? For me, freedom may come to mind, but that's not what I observe daily in politics. I currently think of the word genocide. Why would I think of the word genocide, right? There isn't a mass extermination of groups in America right now, but that's the thing, because there is. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention describes genocide as, quote, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a group as such. A. Killing members of a group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. And E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. There are multiple acts that we are seeing in Florida today against the LGBTQ+ community. Ron DeSantis signed several anti-LGBT bills last Wednesday. Most notably is the final act mentioned of forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. SB 254 is an extreme, unprecedented attack on transgender people, their healthcare, and their families and healthcare providers who care for them. This bill allows children to be taken away from their families just because they are receiving gender-affirming care that could save their lives. Florida is not the only state that is attacking trans youth or has attempted to either. So far in 2023, more than 650 anti-LGBT bills have been proposed, and as youth, we are terrified. 6 bills in New Jersey and 3 bills in Pennsylvania. We are only in the 5th month of the year. The number and extremeness of the bills continue to get worse and worse. To be clear, I'm not accusing of this happening in our district at all. This is to bring onto the table what is spreading at an alarming rate across the country and to ask, what are we preparing to do in an attempt to make our students, my peers, and friends feel safe in PV? What are you planning to do to address and comfort a large population of students who are watching their rights stripped state by state? What are the policies that protect marginalized students in the district? We are not going to be erased.
Anyone else? Okay. 5.03 is the proposed meeting dates for 23-24. 04 is the recording disclaimer, and without objection, I'll rule adjournment.